Hello and welcome to the second part in the 4-voice counterpoint videos. In this video, we're going to go over 4-voice species counterpoint. So we're going to go over first, second, third, fourth, and fifth species also known as florid counterpoint. In the next video, we're going to be getting away from species counterpoint and developing into a Bach style counterpoint. Now that we have more voices, we have a more full harmony, but this comes at an expense. This means that the parts have a reduction in how free they can move because they have to work in conjunction with one another. Now that we're using all 4 of the voices, every single diatonic 7th chord can now be used. We still want to treat these with the proper rules. This means the 7th intervals are going to be approached and resolved properly. This might differ depending on what note and scale degree you're using to represent that 7th of the chord at the moment. We also want the 7th chords to be cantable and resolved properly, meaning that they're easily sung. Someone could be able to hear it and they could sing back what they just heard. That is a very important attribute to a lot of music. Of course, if the listener can follow everything extremely carefully, it might get kind of boring. But that's why there are certain sections of the song. We're not getting into sections here, but further on in my channel, we will be getting into sections where we will see things like how the chorus of a song is the perfect moment to make something that the listener can follow along and sing along to. And then when you go into a different section, let's say an instrument is doing a solo part, well, this is a perfect time for the soloist to actually show their virtuosity and to show off a little bit. And with this, you might be able to follow what they're doing to an extent, but with them showing off and stuff, it might be a little too complex for at least the average listener to then try to hum or whistle that back. But that is what makes it more impressive as the solo. So there are good times and places for certain things. And of course, with these rules here, all this has to do with how strict you actually want to be. These rules do help with voice leading, so they're all aimed towards trying to get each voice heard independently. But we need to keep in mind that as music adapted, the 7th intervals weren't always approached and resolved so carefully. And of course, properly is the terms of being strict. So not approaching a 7th chord properly is going to result in it being more surprising. And it also might be not as nice of a transition into that chord. But again, this might be useful at certain moments. And then on the other side, not resolving a 7th chord properly can leave the listener feeling a little bit unsure, like they expected something to happen and it didn't happen, a little bit unexpected. So we can see that knowing the rules is a good thing, because then when you want to go and break the rules, you can imagine what the outcome can be, and you can begin to craft your music in a way that the listener is going to hear these certain things that you put into it, like certain moments that are going to completely surprise the listener. I wanted to mention this more at the end to kind of isolate it by itself more, and that is that we're still going to have to look out for note doublings. And this is when we are doubling what people call tendency tones, or some other people call it active tones. And these are notes that have a tendency to resolve a certain way, like the 7th of a chord. We don't have to worry about this in the penultimate measure, which means the second to last measure. And this is because sometimes we want to do a perfect, authentic cadence. And sometimes we're going to have no choice but to just double certain notes and even do some similar motion, or in other words, direct motion. I'm going to get more into not doubling the tendency tones a little bit later. I have a whole video about this, so I'm not going to get too much into that, but I'm just going to mention a little bit more and actually give a specific example to where you might want to think about this a little bit further. Before moving on to the next page, it's good to keep in mind that you should sing each line as you're writing it to be able to hear what it's going to sound like, and then also practice your audiation at the same time. This is being able to read a score and hear it in your head. And practice makes perfect. So if you read your score and you hear what it's going to sound like in your head, and then you play it back and it sounds a little different, well, then you're just going to have to slowly adapt. And like I said, practice makes perfect. After a while, it's not going to be so difficult, and you're going to be able to read each line and hear it in your head. Okay, so before we get into this example here on this next page, we're going to listen to it. And for all the next examples, I will have a playback of it in the beginning. And I will also have each of the pages timestamped in the video so you can find them easily. And then you'll easily be able to see the playback in the beginning every time. Okay, so in this example, the cantus is in the soprano. Using 4 voices now allows us to have more freedom in each of the parts. This results in things like notes being doubled, and also using leaps that would seem unwanted in the earlier exercises. Of course, it is always good to have a reason for why you are choosing the note you are choosing, but it is also good to experiment and try out new ideas, even if there's not a reason or understanding behind it. Before, we were thinking simply, which is aiming towards good voice leading and not making contrapuntal mistakes. Now that we have enough practice with doing that, we can now set a new goal, and that is making individual lines that are both interesting and work together harmoniously. If we look at the second measure, we see a harmonic interval of an 11th. This is between the alto and the tenor. This interval is not a problem because you can still follow the voice leading of each voice just fine. We still want to avoid notes that should not be doubled for certain reasons. This is where I was saying I'm going to explain the tendency tones a little more, which again, some people call active tones. And on a simple level, these are notes that have a tendency to do something, but usually this is simply resolving in a specific direction. If we double these, it's going to result in parallel octaves, since you have 2 different notes that want to both resolve to the same note. They have a tendency to resolve very specifically. For example, we have the leading tone or the 7th in a 7th chord. Both of these are in a 5-7 chord. In a 5-7 chord in C major, you have the notes G, B, D, and F. The 3rd of the chord is the note B, which is the leading tone of the scale. This naturally wants to resolve up. Then the 7th of the chord is F. F is a semitone away from the note below it in the scale. This is E. So because of that, we see that the B wants to resolve up and the F wants to resolve down. If we think about simple solfeggio, we can see that the F would be Fa, which wants to resolve down to Mi. If we take it a step further and go into hexachordal solfege, then we can think about this a little differently. When we look at the natural hexachord, we see Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, which has the notes C through A when we're thinking about C major here. But this is not thinking about major or minor. This is thinking about modes and using hexachords. So we're using the natural hexachord, and since we want to keep the B natural, we want to keep the C major, in other words, we're going to use the hard hexachord, which starts on G, which is assigned to Do, and then we have Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La. So when we look at it this way, this can shed a little bit of light into that 5/7 chord, and also why it wants to resolve the way it does, but looking at it in a different lens, looking at this in a different way. Because when we're thinking about counterpoint here, a lot of times how it was taught was in a modal way, using modes, and also thinking about hexachords and hexachordal solfege. The reason the natural hexachord is called the natural hexachord is because it doesn't contain the note B. When we look at the soft hexachord, we see it starts on the note F, and that is assigned to Do. And again, we have Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, but this time we have a B flat, and this is because Mi and Fa are always a half step away. So we see in this case, there's a half step between A and B flat, and that is the Mi-Fa relationship in the soft hexachord. But of course, we're using the hard hexachord because we want to use the B natural. So when we're combining both of the hexachords, the natural and the hard, we see the entire scale of C major. And furthermore, when we combine them, it goes through 10 notes. So we have the full octave plus a third above that. As we see, it ends on E instead of C. But looking at this a little more, we can see that there is a half step between E and F, which is mi and fa. This is why when we have that F as our 7th in our 5/7 chord, it wants to resolve down to the E. There's the half step. But this is another way of looking at it through the solfege and saying it is the fa going back to the mi, because we're already on fa, so it naturally wants to go to mi. Okay, and then on the contrary, we see that when we look at the hard hexachord, we see the mi-fa relationship between B and C. And since we had the note B in our chord, the mi wants to go up to fa. So these are tendency tones, and we see they're acting in the same way, but they have a different effect. And what I mean by this, acting the same way, is that they just want to travel a half step away. That is what is happening in both cases. They're not going to travel the other way, which is the full step. For example, fa going to sol or mi going to re. You're going to have a full step in both of these circumstances, but when you land on mi, it is already a half step away from fa. When you land on fa, it is already a half step away from mi. So this is a different way of looking at this, but this can be very helpful. Because when you're looking at your hexachord here and you're combining both of them, and this is the scale that you're using here, you can easily see that mi-fa relationship, and you can use this to your advantage. You can be aware of this. And then furthermore, when we get to using notes that are outside the key or chromatic notes, those are also going to act as tendency tones. Therefore, they shouldn't be doubled, because then again, we're going to have parallel octaves. When we look at measure 5, we can see it has 3 F sharps and only 1 A. This is not a problem, although I did mention mi is a tendency tone, which oftentimes wants to go to fa. We see here we don't have to always be extremely strict and follow those exact cookie cutter rules. We see everything here is approached fine, and it also goes away into the next measure perfectly fine. And when we get into the next measure, measure 6, we see a 6/5 chord built on scale degree 3, or in other words, a 3/6/5 chord. Being an inversion of the 7th appears in the alto voice. Some people might call this a first inversion 7th chord. It's just another way of looking at this. This works out perfectly fine, because first of all, we see the 7th of the chord in the alto voice is approached by a step. This then resolves down a step in the next measure. So it is approached fine, and it is resolved fine. Of course, in the key, the chord built on the 3rd scale degree would be F sharp A, C, E, being a 7th chord. But when we do the first inversion, or in other words, a 6/5 chord, then we have the notes A, C, E, F sharp. And we see this stayed strict to that. And of course, the notes above the bass note can be rearranged in different orders. As long as they're still the notes that belong to the 7th chord, it is the bass note that tells you what inversion it is. But in this case, we see that it stayed true to the exact notes in the inversion. We see an A, C, E, and F sharp in order. Now we want to remember all of the rules from the beginning lessons until now. We want to be able to have good part writing at ease and not think about it too much. One of these lessons is from the very first one-to-one counterpoint video. This is to have peaks or troughs occurring at separate times for each of your individual voices. We see that the bass voice peaks twice. This is not a problem, and it works out fine in this scenario. This is because all of the lines are harmonizing together. They're using the same note durations. If the bass was using floored counterpoint, then the leaps would stick out a lot more, and being a bass voice, being the bass support, that should be avoided. Of course, you can always come up with clever things that sound good, but this is the general consensus. In this example, the cantus is in the tenor. Using second species, we need to have a good balance between stepwise motion and leaps. We want to use mostly steps, but we also want to have a good amount of leaps to keep some interest, and we do see that was accomplished here in the response. In modal situations, we have more flexibility. Notice that the last note in the bass hits a low point, and this is a point in the register that has not been seen before. This is lower than any other note that has occurred before. This helps make a more coherent ending. We can also see that in each of the individual voices, the peaks occur at different times. In this example, the cantus was in the alto. As you probably picked up by now, we're just doing the species response in one of the voices, and we're choosing which of the voices we want to do. The other voices, we're still doing the whole note response, and in the next videos where we completely get away from the whole notes using 4 voices, which is when we get into more of the Bach style counterpoint. But all of these little baby steps and training wheels along the way are going to be very helpful. Again, right off the bat, we can see there are high points in each of the voices and they occur at different times. When we look at measures 2, 4, and 8, we see 7th chords that are both prepared and resolved properly. In measure 4, we have a chord built on scale degree 6. In the beginning, it is a 6-4-3 chord, which would be a second inversion 7th chord. But then by the end of that measure, we see there is the root of that chord established, which makes it seem more like a root position 6-7 chord. Okay, so if you were to call that a certain chord in that measure, we could just call that chord 6. But when we're thinking about inversions, we see it wasn't completely stable, and it expressed both the 6-4-3 and the 6 root position 7th chord. The 7th does occur in the alto voice, which is the cantus, and when we look at measure 8, the last beat, the voice crossing is totally fine. This is because it occurs on the weak beat and also resolves to the proper voice. When we're looking at the tenor voice, we see G resolves down to F. But when we look at the bass voice, we see the note A, which leaps up an octave again to A. This is occurring on the weak beat, but we see that on beat 3, which is the other strong beat other than beat 1, in this measure using a 4/4 time signature, we can see that the A is actually being used as the resolution, and the leap of an octave is sort of decorating and adding some more interest in the fact that the A is resolving up to that D there. Something like this would be too much for the first beat, but this works fine here at the very end. Before I go into the next page, I just want to go back to measure 4 and mention that that 7th chord is of course approached and resolved properly. We see it is approached by a step and it is left by a step. And of course this is staying very true to the strict counterpoint. Again, like I was saying, knowing when to follow these rules and when to bend these rules is going to help create the style of music that you want. And of course, every person is going to have their own outlook on this. But in these counterpoint videos, I like to teach the very strict rules, at least from the beginning, and as they progress, slowly get away from that. This is actually going to be my second to last video in the counterpoint series. After my next video, which is going to be getting away from the species counterpoint, I'm still going to include counterpoint in my videos and lessons on counterpoint, but I'm going to end this counterpoint series because at this point it has taught in all the species from 2 voices, 3 voices, and 4 voices, along with a lot of other random things within the actual playlist and in each individual video. A lot of tips and also different lessons from different people who have slightly different outlooks on counterpoint as a whole. And of course, these people are well respected on their own for what they do, but I like to combine some different approaches and give some options in my videos. So that's why here in the 4-voice counterpoint video, I'm going to have the part 1, 2, and 3, and we also saw multiple parts in the 3-voice videos. If you missed out on the 3-voice counterpoint videos, those are extremely good because in that I keep saying how much you're probably going to be using 3-voice counterpoint, and knowing how to write good 3-voice counterpoint is very important. There are little things that occur in each of the different amounts of voices, so studying each of them separately is probably just going to save you time in the long run when you want to go and actually write your music, because you're going to be able to do it a lot quicker, not think about it as much, and not have to watch videos explaining things, because you will be taught so many things that you're just going to know what to do. we're looking at fourth species. In this example, the cantus is in the bass. We see measure 5 through 6, there is direct motion into an octave. This occurs in the outer voices. It is similar motion, but it is not parallel motion. This is fine because the suspensions are the main focus for the listener at the moment. Measure 5 and 6 are also using the same chord, chord 4, the chord built on the 4th scale degree of the key at the moment. The problem with direct motion to an octave or fifth is that the leap causes focus on where it lands on the new harmony, but then it sounds dull once it lands there. This does not apply in this situation. Then when we look at measure 8, we see a 5-4-3 chord used for the cadence. This is one of the only choices when the cantus ends stepwise. Okay, so now we're looking at fifth species, or what some people call florid counterpoint. This is a counterpoint that uses a combination of the different species. Some people choose to do a suspension-based florid counterpoint, while some simply choose just to combine each of the different species when they want to. We see this one stayed pretty simple, mostly using a fourth species counterpoint approach. The cantus is in the alto voice, and here using fifth species, we have more rhythmic freedom, which makes it easier to avoid parallel fifths and octaves because we have more notes to work with. In measure 3 and 4, the potential parallel fifth between the tenor and the bass are avoided. In measure 5 and 6, the descending stepwise motion grabs the attention of the listener and brings them into a climax of a low point. Maybe the opposite of what you might think of what people call a climax, but the point is it reaches that low point, and it is a sort of climactic period, maybe in an inverse fashion since it's going down. Measure 8, we see a leap of an octave, which helps with avoiding parallel motion. With a neighbor tone embellishment of the note F, we can see that this measure is highlighting the note F. The soprano resolves by step, making a smooth ending. We also see that rather large leap in the bass voice in the second to last measure on beat 4, and this also helps with the cadence having that feeling of being the final chord. Okay, we see this example used a combined species approach, and this is a lot more difficult using 4 parts. So if you want a real challenge, try to complete one of these combined species using 4 parts. 7th chords allow more choices and can actually allow the completion of the exercise to be easier. 4 independently moving parts results in more harmonic ambiguity, where sometimes a measure might seem to express 2 different chords that are interwoven together. Instead of doing combined species here, like we have in this example, in the next video where we're getting away from species counterpoint using 4 voices, we're going to begin that with florid counterpoint in multiple voices, which is going to be sort of a stepping stone of getting away from the species approach using 4 voices. And then from there, I'm going to show a more free counterpoint writing style, which is going to allow you to write in your own style. Remember that quantity counts, and that if you want to have a lot of good experience with this, then you're going to have to complete a lot of exercises. And this means preferably doing species 1 through 5, like shown in this video, and completing at least 15, if not 20 exercises for each of those. That might seem kind of crazy, but that's if you really want to take this seriously. Of course, you don't have to do quite that much, and it's up to you, but you should at least do 1 of each of the different species that were shown in this video. Then, of course, when we get more into the free writing counterpoint, it might actually be worth it to spend more time doing a lot more of those, because you might come up with more material you actually want to use in your songs. But you can also see that you can find a lot of inspiration and ideas just from the simple examples that were shown in this video, And of course, you can further embellish what you wrote, add more notes, passing notes, neighboring notes, and of course using rests, which is something we don't see in the species approach. So get ready to see the use of rests in the next video. So that's it for this video. In my previous videos, I already taught a lot using species counterpoint. So that's why I didn't go over in detail so much in this video. But the real challenge is actually to be doing the exercises yourself. So now you have some examples, you can have some inspiration on what to do. And furthermore, you can see that we're going to start off just doing 3 of the voices using whole notes and only 1 of the voices using the species counterpoint. So it's going to be a lot easier starting this way. Again, like I have in this last example, if you want to start combining the different species, you can do that. We still see whole notes being used in the bass voice. And of course, from here, you could even go as far as to embellish that bass voice and add some more notes, add some rests, and to make it even more interesting. Furthermore, you can try something like doing 2 of the voices using whole notes and then the other 2 voices using the species of your choice. We do see each of the species has a different sound. So that's why it is good to actually practice them, because not only do you familiarize yourself with the sound of what it sounds like to have a passage of constant quarter notes, but you also have practice on how to complete a passage of constant quarter notes. Sometimes having one voice doing one species can actually make it a lot easier to follow for the listener. Like I was explaining, when we get further more into the next videos and we actually get into writing complete pieces or songs, we're going to have certain sections even within the one movement or one song. Because of this, we're going to have certain passages. We might have a passage that acts like a bridge, and in this we might have 2 voices with quarter notes, 1 voice doing a second species approach using half notes, and then the other voice doing a third species approach doing quarter notes. Okay, so I'll see you on the next video, part 3, 4-voice counterpoint, getting away from species and whole note cantus. If you got use out of this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment telling me what you liked about it. If there's anything you think could be improved, leave a comment about that too. I'd love to see that. And make sure you leave a comment if you have any questions and are confused about anything. To make sure you don't miss it when I post videos, subscribe to my channel. And until next time, take care and goodbye.